Introduction, but first of all I'd like to say a big thank you for giving me this opportunity to come and share some of the adventures and stories and some of the lessons that I've learnt along some of the adventures. I'm going to be talking for about 30-40 minutes depending on how we get on for time, but I'm conscious that some of you might need to be getting away, so if you do disappear I won't take offence, so feel free if you do need to get away for other meetings. But talking about networking, the reason I'm actually here is because I met Marie a couple of weeks ago and told me about this event and the opportunity to be a guest speaker, which then made an introduction to Anita, and then I met with Anita, told her about some of the adventures I've been involved, and then got invited to come here. So it's amazing how sort of the connections can lead to opportunities. And I've never set myself up as a guest speaker. I just sort of, because of the lifestyle that I've led, it's led to different opportunities to come and be able to share those experiences. So as I say, it's not something that I don't promote myself as a guest speaker. It's more of opportunities that have arisen through talking to other people and being able to share stories and opportunities. So the adventure I'm going to talk to you about is called Cycling Nomads, and back in 2008 my partner and myself made the decision to go and leave our jobs and cycle the length of South America. Our dream was actually to cycle from Ushuaia down in the furthest point in South America. If anybody knows Tierra del Fuego, it's the furthest point you can start. And then our dream was to get to Alaska. Unfortunately, after about 11 months on the road, we got some news that we had to cut the trip short and come back because a family member had got very sick, and I couldn't carry on cycling knowing that if that family member was not to survive, then I would not forgive myself for not being there to give them that support. So we decided to cut the trip short to come home. So we've got unfinished business, and I'll tell you about the next project which I'm working on for the future. So November 2008 we started in Ushuaia, Tierra del Fuego, and we cycled all the way up to Mexico. So here I'm going to share some photos and also some of the things that I learned along the way. So, big thing is, we all have dreams, but in order to make dreams become a reality, it takes an awful lot of determination, dedication, self-discipline and effort. So how did this dream come about? As a child, I was very blessed. I was brought up in Spain, and I can always remember having an atlas in my room. So I used to pore over that atlas as a child and imagine what would it be like to go and discover all these places. And one of my childhood dreams was actually to cycle around Spain. And I always set that as a childhood dream. And I was working in South America back in 2001, and that's where I met my partner Kelly. And we were both working as adventure travel tour leaders for a travel company leading trips out in Peru on the Inca Trail. And we would start talking about childhood dreams. And I said to Kelly, one of my childhood dreams was to cycle around Spain. And she said, well, why don't we do it? And I'm like, well, why don't we do it? So we both finished our contracts. I went on to do another contract in Cuba. Kelly had a contract in Spain. And we finished our contracts, came back to the UK, met up, went out, bought 2 bikes, and flew into Bilbao. And we went and cycled all around Spain. 8 weeks later, we decided, well, what are we going to do now? So we came back to Poole and then started, I started working with the RLI, and Kelly retrained as a school teacher. So it's interesting how following our childhood dreams sort of led to that sort of wanting to go and off and do more adventures. And then after 5 years of working in the UK, we were sort of, what are we doing now? So we went out for a walk along the Puerbex, and we all kind of said to each other, if there's one thing you could do right now, what would it be? And we both answered, I'd like to do some more cycling. So we said, well, what's stopping us? Why don't we do it? So again, the seed for this trip was sown, and we then started to put everything in place to make this trip happen. And I love this photo because it says Ushuaia, end of the world, beginning of everything. You know, and it was quite ironic that we were there having planned this trip for about 18 months, getting all the logistics in place to be able to go off, quit our jobs and go and cycle the length of South America. So first of all, the first day out after 18 months of planning this trip, you know, I built the bikes myself, researched what were the best bikes and spent a lot of time. And that first day out, just as we were leaving Ushuaia, my front rack cracked and collapsed. And this was on a Sunday in the middle of Ushuaia, and it was like, I couldn't have, what a worse way to start this adventure. But then it was dealing with challenges, and we were going to face with a number of challenges throughout the whole journey. So we had to be resourceful, and we had to be able to tap into local networks. And fortunately we met somebody on the road, and they said, oh yeah, there's a welder up there. He's probably not open on a Sunday, but if you knock on his door, I'm sure he'll help you out. So we pushed the bikes up there, knocked on the door, guy came, hey, yeah, no problem, just pop your bike in and I'll fix it for you. And straight away, it was a little hairline crack that had happened in one of the racks. And the only reason I can think it happened is when it was on the plane, it might have just been squashed slightly and damaged itself. But that's our first day out of Ushuaia. We were already facing a mechanical failure on the bike. And as I say, within an hour, we were back on the road, cycling out of Ushuaia, heading north. And the first day we were faced with pretty much 4 seasons in one day. And this is coming out of the pass that just leads out of Ushuaia in heavy snowfall. And pushing the bikes up that first hill. And people ask me, how much training had you done to do this? And yeah, we were regular cyclists, and we'd go out and cycle most days around. But we were never sort of super athletes. We decided that we're not going to spend hours and hours training every day. We'll build up an endurance. And if one day we only do 10k, so be it. If one day we do 20, and we slowly built up sort of the average miles per day. And also we decided that we weren't going to put any time pressure on ourselves. If we decided that we arrived in a place that we found we'd like to spend a few days exploring, that's what we did. But however, Tierra del Fuego is very, very remote with not a lot there. A lot of sheep farms. And what's really nice is that they've built all these refuge, because a lot of people move with their sheep, and if they get caught out by the weather, they can come into one of these shelters and seek shelter from the weather. And these were an absolute blessing for us, because we were able to stop many a times and wrap ourselves up nice and warm out of the elements. And if anybody knows much about Patagonia, it is a vast, immense place with some spectacular sceneries, but also renowned for the wind. And the wind was very predictable, because it used to come on about 12 o'clock. It's almost like somebody turned a switch on and the wind would arrive. And that's where these refuges would be an absolute godsend. And that's what it was like inside. And we had to be prepared, especially for the first part of the journey, because we knew that we were going to be in extreme conditions of possibly really, really cold temperatures. So we need to carry enough equipment to allow us to, and we decided that we were going to camp for most of the way. So that's Kelly tucked away in a 4-season sleeping bag, and you can see the rain sort of dripping off our equipment there, because we got quite wet. And then as we progressed, we start to come across a lot of what are called estancias, which are big sheep farms and there. And the lifestyle they lead, they have these group of workers that live there. A lot of them are seasonal workers that come in for different parts of the season. But going back, it was like going back 100 years. The lifestyle they led, the way they cooked and everything, and the hospitality we received. You know, after cycling for about 40, 50k, and then to come up to an estancia and say, oh, any chance that we can camp on your land? Next thing, oh, no, you don't need to camp, come in, we've got a spare room here for some of the workers, come and use these rooms. Are you hungry? And then the next thing, we're invited to dinner. And you can see they had the chef there preparing the food for the workers. And I say, we didn't want to impose on them, because we didn't feel that was the right thing to do. However, the hospitality they offered was like they wanted to, and being able to sit down for dinner and end up sharing stories for hours on end. It was just, what an experience, you know, and it was all very impromptu as well. You know, there's no expectations, and it was just such a simple way of just being able to sit down in the evenings, no televisions, no internet, and just share stories with people and listening to everybody's different stories.
How important was it you spoke Spanish fluently?
It helped. It did help, but again, it wasn't necessarily a barrier to their hospitality, because we've met other travellers that weren't necessarily fluent in Spanish, but they had received similar hospitality, and that's where you just communicate as best you can. Yeah, and sometimes just being able to just point at things or some basic knowledge of the language really, really helped. And then again, the scenery that we were faced with. And for me, what I really learned is that sometimes in life, the less you have, the easier life is, and we relied pretty much on what we were carrying on those bikes. Yeah. And we were very, very strict, because when you're cycling with all that weight, it gets quite challenging, so we were very, very strict in how much equipment we carried. And a lot of it became a bit of a survival. You know, so it was about where are we going to get our water from, where are we going to get our food from, where are we going to sleep tonight, you know, where are we going to pitch our tent. So everything was very strict back to the sort of basics of human needs. And that for me was quite refreshing, because it sort of, you got rid of a lot of the things that tie you down in a daily life. And that just being in that open road was just like an amazing awakening to what an amazing world we live in. You know, and sometimes the simplest things in life are what can make you happy. And then again, seeing some of the spectacular glaciers down there. You know, the Perito Moreno Glacier, which is tucked in the Andes there, just about a quarter of the way up through Patagonia. And again, to be able to stand there looking down on these glaciers was absolutely fascinating. And then some of the camp spots, where we camped by that lake, that was our view from our room. And we weren't paying for that, you know, it was just being able to pitch up our tent in these spectacular sceneries and just look out of your tent and see, wow, I'm actually camping here looking at that view. That is priceless. And then the open road, you know, especially the first few weeks going through Patagonia, you have these winding roads where they're not paved, so it's all off-road. So it was constant battering and trying to cycle. And then at about 12 o'clock that wind would come in and we had to seek shelter. Also the animals we saw as well, you know, armadillo. So we'd be cycling along and then an armadillo would cross the road and like, wow, this is amazing. And then you'd see the rheas, which are like an emu ostrich type bird. And they're like the Roadrunners, if you remember the cartoon, the Roadrunners. They'd come across and they'd just run, start running, and they wouldn't stop. And then you can just about see there a guanaco, which is a type of llama. And again, just seeing them in their natural habitat. And occasionally you'd see condors. You would look up and you just see the condors just circling around in the sky. And again, being in nature just sort of reminds you of the world that we live in, and what an important duty we have to make sure that we look after the world. And then this was a typical campsite spot, so we'd try and shelter ourselves from the wind. So if we had a culvert or a bridge, we'd try and tuck ourselves in to get out of the wind. And it was really beautiful, because you'd come out at night and just stare at the stars, and you could just stargaze for hours in the immense skies. And then again, as we started to head further north, we'd crisscross the border in and out between Argentina and Chile, and then we travelled along the Carretera Austral, which is in the Chilean side, and the scenery along there, it's like a rainforest, and you can see the lush vegetation in there. And what was really good about that is that the water supply was not a problem, because we could literally go to streams, fill our water bottles up, and drink straight from the streams. And we tried to do it sustainably as well, is that we didn't want to be buying loads of plastic bottles, so I actually bought a ceramic filter which allows us to filter all our water. So our philosophy is if the local people will drink the water from that source, we'll try and do the same. If they say they don't, then we'll filter it. And that's how we tried to again maintain ourselves without leaving too much of a trail behind us.
Did you ever make a mistake with drinking the wrong water?
We had a couple of occasions where we got sick, but I can't specifically put it down to drinking the water. But yeah, we tended to be quite strict in terms of if the locals specifically said to you, do not drink the water, then we would really follow that advice. But when you actually looked at some of the water sources that they were using for their daily water needs, you think, wow, do they really drink this? As it kind of put things into context. And so I would make a discretionary call as to whether I filtered it or not. And I would like to say 60–70% of the time I usually filtered it just as a backup for us, really. If they've been drinking it all their life, their immune system is used to that, whereas for us coming into that environment, we had to build our immune systems up. And then people that we met along the way, we thought we were doing this amazing adventure and we're like out there, and then suddenly we'd get a British couple in their 4x4 that had been travelling down from Alaska. You know, so we start to meet more and more people out there doing these types of journeys. And then I was very lucky. I worked in Chile in 1997 with the Raleigh International Expedition, and I got to know this farming community very well. And when I finished my expedition, I went and stayed with them for a whole month. And I went back to visit them, and as traditional in Chile, they like to roast their meat. So they actually put on a traditional Chilean barbecue, which was a lamb there. And as I say, they live very, very much in touch with the nature. Their animals are really, really precious, their livestock, and they have very traditional ways of farming. And what's interesting is that this is very, very close to all the colonies where the Welsh settled back in the late 1800s. And some of the farm machinery that is still being used on these farms are what the Welsh brought out there back in the late 1800s. So to actually see the land being ploughed with a plough from the late 1800s still being used, being by oxen cart, and also the, as I say, phenomenal to see the lifestyles. And again, maintaining very, very traditional ways of cattle rearing. These were spectacular. These are the monkey puzzle trees, which are original from Chile. To actually go through forests of these monkey puzzle trees was actually fascinating. And then again, some of the landscapes that we camped in. This is under an active volcano, and you can just see all the lava flows. And occasionally we'd be camped and you'd hear this big explosion, and there'd be a bit of lava being spat over the top, which was quite scary, but also sort of making you realise that how we are reliant on nature, in terms of nature has power, and we're there as guests, really. And then again, just another picture of some of the scenery that we went through. And a lot of it was, the only way was up. And I actually had an altimeter on my watch, and we worked out over the 11 months that we were cycling, we'd done the equivalent of Everest 13 times coming down. So it was quite phenomenal. And some days we were actually pushing up. And we tried to keep away from busy roads because we didn't want to be on the busy road. We tried to sort of look for sort of routes that were less sort of main routes. So by getting ourselves sort of further inland or away from the big routes, it allowed us to explore some really remote communities, which meant quite challenging cycling conditions at time, and a lot of pushing uphill at times. But yeah, the rewards were phenomenal because we'd arrive in little villages, and they were very curious as to what we were doing. What are these two idiots doing on their bicycles? Do you need a place to stay? And as I say, the hospitality we received, because they were curious and we were curious, and we were able to share some amazing experiences in terms of sitting down, having dinners. And to this day, I'm still in touch with some of the people that we met 10 years ago. You know, so it is, yeah. And as I say, time and tide will wait for no man. So if you have dreams, if there is things that you want to do in life, take those opportunities. Yeah. And this was an opportunity that we took, and looking back on it, it's something that will live with us for the rest of our lives. And as we started to get north, especially on the Chilean side, we started to arrive into the Atacama Desert. And we were quite worried. This was one of the areas of the trip that quite worried me, because I knew that water was very, very scarce. So we weren't going to be able to stop in streams and filter water and get water. So we had to plan our days very, very carefully. And usually every sort of 60 to 100 kilometres they have these truck stops where you can get water. And most of that water is brought in by lorries, so it's quite a precious commodity. And again, what you'll find is along the road, the Chileans and the South Americans as a whole like their religious shrines. So it was interesting seeing all the different shrines that had been put up along the roads with different people asking for different things, and you could read notes, and quite an interesting place to stop and spend a couple of minutes looking at what people were going through and asking for. And then we were cycling near Antofagasta on the north side of Chile, and suddenly this huge hand appeared out in the desert, and this is a sculpture that was done to sort of represent the sort of people that are looking for things in life. And there's this sculpture, and there's one on the Chilean side, and there's another one in the east coast and on the west coast, and they're linked. And as I say, it's quite spectacular to sort of see this hand appear in the middle of the desert out of nowhere. And then again, some of the places that we arrived to were like ghost towns. This is from the British were out in the North Atacama Desert in the late 1800s, and it was all stemmed by the nitrates industry. So there's these whole towns and communities that built up sort of the late 1800s and 1900s, early 1900s. However, when the nitrate industry declined, these whole infrastructures, just people left. And to go back, they're almost 100 years later, you're walking through these ghost towns, but everything, and this is a railway network that was set in place. And as I say, just to be able to walk around these places, it was almost a little bit eerie to think that 100 years ago, these whole communities built up around that nitrate industry. After about 20 years, when the nitrate need for nitrates declined, the whole infrastructure that was left behind was quite amazing. And then going through some key sort of geographical points, so the tropics, and then moving on into the Atacama Desert, again sceneries that were just breathtaking. And then looking for those little camp spots, again we found little spots that had a little bit of a stream where we could access the water. But what was quite interesting in Chile is that a lot of the communities that were in the Andes have had to move because they no longer have that water supply. And also the mining industry all along the Andes is taking a lot of that water away. So a lot of communities that relied on that water coming down from the mountains, because the mining companies have actually started to take that water for the mining industry, it's completely taken away the livelihoods of these communities. So it's quite interesting again visiting all these remote communities that have slowly declined because of lack of resources that have been no longer available to them. And then this is when we crossed into Bolivia, a small little mining town on the top of about 4,000 meters of altitude, a place called Oyagüe on the Bolivian and Chilean border. But yet the skies were absolutely spectacular, and the feeling of being out there. And then again looking at some of the old machinery that was brought into to help build all the roads and railway networks to support that industry. And then coming into these remote Bolivian villages that rely on the alpacas and the llamas for their livelihoods. And again the hospitality we received. It was just, again, you could not have asked for more. And then we got into the salt plains of Salar de Uyuni. If anybody knows Bolivia, there's these huge salt plains, and this is a little island in the salt lake. And being able to see that was absolutely spectacular. And we thought, wow, we are in the middle of this salt plain, middle of nowhere, hardly anybody around, and we met this couple cycling. Not only cycling, but they had their 2 kids with them. So he was a Scottish guy and she was Australian, and they'd taken 6 months out to go cycling. And they were cycling in Bolivia with their 2- and 4-year-old. And this is a picture of their kids. So we thought, God, we thought what we were doing was hard. They're doing it with their 2 kids. And it was fascinating to see the sort of the childhood they were having. It's like exploring things, and we're like, God, wow. different perspective. And then other travellers that we met. This Brazilian guy we met on the going into Cusco in Peru, and he'd been on the road for 13 years. He left Brazil 13 years ago with hardly anything, but he just had this desire to go and travel, and he travelled the whole of South America. And we met him while he was in Peru, and we had about an hour. We just got talking, and the stories he was telling, and it was just fantastic. What a way of life that I would never have imagined. 13 years cycling around South America, and you can see all the little mementos he gathered along the way. He's like, why are you carrying that big Michelin man? And he told me the story that somebody had given to him, and he didn't feel he could get rid of it because it meant quite a lot of sentimental value. And then we got into Cusco, which is where Kelly and I originally met, so that was quite a special moment in the Plaza de Armas in Cusco to revisit some of the places we had worked when we were working for the travel company. And then there was days where we just thought, oh God, what are we doing? You had about 4 or 5 days, because the way the valleys worked, you'd climb for about 3 or 4 days, get to the top, get down to the other side in about 20 minutes, and then you had another 3 days to get to the top before you did that again. So yeah, looking at things like that, like, oh right, really? But you just had to manage it in small little bite-sized chunks, and there was no pressure again. If we just did 20k a day, that was enough. And then we got into the north of Peru, and we dropped into the jungle, a place called Huánuco, and we came across, it was Easter, and we came across these most amazing religious celebrations where they were enacting the crucifixion of Jesus, and they had a French guy that they brought in specifically to play the part of Jesus, and we were the only foreigners apart from the French guy who was playing Jesus, so everybody thought we were related to him, so they kept on asking us, oh, what's he doing? Well, it was like, no, we're just here as guests. So it was quite funny, and we followed the whole procession for the whole day, to the point where they went outside of the village and reenacted the crucifixion, so it was quite interesting watching. They actually tied his hand, but in some places they actually still, as a reenactment, they actually do crucify people. In some countries, yes. It's shocking, but that's what they do. It's their. No, fortunately they didn't. They just tied him on, and
you two weren't the ones on either side.
Well, that's quite amazing. And then coming out into Peru, this is Huaraz, Cordillera Blanca. If anybody remembers the Touching the Void film or book, if you've read it, it's this is Cerro Huaraz, which is where that incident happened, and we were cycling along and then dropping down back onto the coastline through these spectacular canyons. And it's like the scenery, and it's like if you fell off there you wouldn't probably have much chance of getting back up there, but how these little roads have been cut into the side of the mountains and people use them to get up into the hills and back out of them. It's like really, really precarious, but as I say, it's spectacular how they've managed to build these feats to try and communicate between the hills and the coast. And then again, more cyclists. These were Argentinian brothers that were cycling around, and then meeting local children in communities. And when we set off, we decided we were going to do it for charity as well. So we were raising funds for Julia House here in Poole, and we were also raising funds for an international charity called SOS Children's Villages. So along the way we had the opportunity to come and visit some of the projects that we were raising funds for. So that was quite rewarding. And then, as I say, some places we'd arrive and people would come out and mob us and also just want to sort of interact and find out what we were up to. And those spontaneous moments where you just weren't planning on staying there, suddenly you end up staying there for 2 or 3 days and meeting these amazing communities who just want to share the little they have. They want to share with you and listen to your stories, and you listen to their stories. And again, it was just so rewarding to be able to do that. And then again, talking about families on bikes, we met this American couple who was cycling from Alaska to Argentina, and they were actually going to be featured in the World Guinness Book of Records as the youngest children to ever cycle that length. And it was great to follow them because we've been following them from Alaska, and we've been starting from the south, so we eventually got to see them. And then another milestone was going over the equator, you know, going through Ecuador into Colombia. And what was amazing is that everybody was saying, oh, you're going to go into Colombia? You must be crazy. You're going to get mugged, you're going to get robbed, you're going to get murdered. But yet the hospitality of the Colombian people was second to none. And it was interesting because they were running a campaign saying the only danger in Colombia is that you might want to stay. And that was very true, because we did want to stay in Colombia because we absolutely loved it. We spent quite a lot of time on a coffee plantation. We ended up doing some voluntary work at a coffee plantation, and Kelly did some teaching in the local, English teaching in the local community, and those opportunities just came out of nowhere. You know, and it was really difficult to actually leave after we spent 2 weeks in this small community up in the Colombian-Ecuador border. And then going across the Panama Canal, seeing that feat of engineering, we pretty much cycled the length of the Panama Canal, and to actually see all the work that had gone in there to get that canal built. And then a few mechanical problems which we dealt with along the way. But again, we wanted to be self-sufficient and have everything that we needed to be able to fix the bikes, and then tap it into the local communities. And they were so resourceful because they would fix everything. Things like my shoes here in the UK, if you get to the point where your shoes are no longer good, you probably chuck them in the bin. Whereas there, you take them down to the local market and they pretty much give you back a new pair of shoes because they've sewn it all together, fixed it. So they're so resourceful. And that's what I found, that in the UK we no longer have that. Whereas in communities like that, you can go in and find the local shoe fixer. So my message is that this is a brief life, but in its brevity it offers us some splendid moments and some meaningful adventures. And this trip really gave me those opportunities to be able to do that. Meeting local people, trying the local foods, just on the roadside cafes where you'd stop and have a nice empanada. And then going to the local markets, buying the local fresh food. And then finally arriving in Mexico, which was like, wow, did we really cycle all this way? You know, it was fascinating just to get over the border into Mexico. And what I particularly liked is going over the borders, because you always have that hustle and bustle of crossing the borders, and there was all these different people trying to sell you things and offering you services, and it was quite a magical place to go across the different borders and seeing how entrepreneurial people are, setting up all the small businesses that rely on the border crossings. And then my big message to everybody is that 20 years from now you would be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the ones you did do. Therefore, explore, dream and discover. So if you've got any dreams, whether it's a business, whether it's going travelling, whether it's owning a boat or going, you know, you have to work hard to get there, but follow your dreams. And as I say, we did that, and we managed to cycle through 13 countries. In 11 months, we clocked 10,000 miles, an average of about 60 miles a day, that works out at, and we lived on £5 each. So our budget for the whole trip was £10 between the two of us.
What?
£10 for the £10 per day for the whole trip. Yeah, it would have been nice, £10 a day. I'd still be cycling. So we did it on a really, really tight budget. But yet the rewards have been absolutely unforgettable. New friends and unforgettable experiences. So that's really a little bit of a quick whistle-stop tour of some of the things that we experienced cycling through South America.